Hey, this is another episode of Flat Art Show, a podcast. My name is Evan Dom. This is a conversation with Max Graves. He's the creator of the webcomic What Happens Next. That's at whathappensnext.webcomic.ws. This was a conversation in middle February 2025. Thank you for listening. We'll do more of these soon. Have a good day.
I've gone on podcasts before, and every time I introduce myself, it's always just sort of like, I have a webcomic. Because I don't like, it's not, I don't have any sort of like qualifications or accolades that are really worth noting. I just kind of am the guy that I am doing the thing that I do. And it feels weird to like introduce myself in that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the thing about comics, though, is that what accolades even could there be?
That's true.
That's
true. That's a good point.
We're all, the most important thing that any of us have is that we're doing the one weird thing that we want in our self-directed little way. That's, that's important. That's why I am interested in talking to you, basically.
Yeah. That is.
So can you?
Sorry, I was going to say
go
that
ahead.
is sort of the great thing about webcomics is that it's like you can do whatever you want forever. Nobody can stop you.
Is that how it looks to you? So you started this in like 2021, right?
Yes, 2021. Yeah, I was 20 years old. I worked at a Papa John's. I was living in like a housing co-op in Champaign-Urbana in Central Illinois, and with like 9 other people. And I had dropped out of college. I went to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana for media and cinema studies for about 3 months. And then I dropped out because I didn't want to be in college anymore. And there were sort of a lot of personal reasons too. And I had this feeling of like, I want to like do something with my time. I don't want to just like work a bunch of crappy jobs and like, sort of bide my time until I can go back to school or whatever I'm going to do with my life. I want to be like actively producing something. And the first webcomic that I started was actually when I was 19. It was called Normal Girls. And it was one of those things where like it was always a doom project because I had not really like planned it out sufficiently or like put the work in such that like I would be able to keep doing it long term. So I just like, put out like a few sort of like pages worth of and people do still like ask me about it sometimes, but it's not much of a project. But after that, I kind of like stepped away from doing comics for a minute and just kind of like drew stuff and posted it on Twitter and like noodled around. And then I was contacted by the cartoonist Remy Boydell, and she was like, "Oh, I really like your art. You should consider making comics." And I was like, "Okay, I guess." And then I wrote a comic script for what became Dog Names, which then later became the first chapter of my ongoing webcomic, What Happens Next. And it was just sort of like based on like characters that I had come up with in high school. And I was like, I'm going to do something with this. So I wrote this little like one-off comic. And people liked it a lot, and it picked up like more steam than anything else that I had ever done on the internet. And so I was like, I like writing these characters. I like writing this story. I think that I have like more that I want to do. So I'm going to like go write out a big outline for like what the whole webcomic would look like. And then I'm just going to kind of break it down into like chapters and try to do it that way, chapter by chapter, because basically my process is that I write a script, I draw the chapter, and then I write the next script and I write the next chapter. But I think the question that you're getting at is kind of like the climate that I started making webcomics in, because I I get the sense like I'm younger than a lot of the people that you've had on the podcast. Maybe not all of them, but like Meredith Grant and Casey Green, for example, are both obviously from a different generation than me. I'm 23. I'm going to be 24 soon, and sort of like from a different era of the internet than me. And in fact, the internet is very different already from where it was when I was first reading webcomics, and even just 4 years later from like when I started having a webcomic. Because obviously, like, I started out posting What Happens Next directly to Twitter, and I eventually started cross-posting it to Comic Fury, and I consider that more the main home of the webcomic now. But at the time, I just kind of had all of my eggs in the Twitter basket because, like, I was like getting a lot of engagement, comparatively speaking, and I felt like I was getting a lot of eyeballs on my work, and the internet was already in such a state where it was like people don't really want to click a link to go to a website if they don't have to. They just like want to have the thing put in front of them. And Twitter was a way for me to do that, to just be like, okay, I'm just going to post 4 images, and then I'm going to, hit reply and post another 4 images. And I'm going to kind of collect it all into chapters that way. And that worked for me kind of until it didn't anymore. I mean, I still, as of the most recent chapter, I still was posting What Happens Next directly to Twitter as well as onto the Comic Fury site. But I honestly have no idea what Twitter will look like by the time the script for the next chapter is finished and I'm actually drawing it. I definitely don't. I see like the engagement that I get on Twitter, like it has dropped precipitously, even as like my like Patreon numbers and engagement with the website has stayed steady or improved at times.
It's remarkable what's happening to that space in particular, but it feels a little symptomatic of a larger shift, maybe. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a particularly grotesque example, maybe. You are entering into this stuff in a different world than a lot of people that I know in comics. Most of the people that I have talked to in this show so far, and most of the people that I get into sorts of long, high context conversations about this stuff are like exactly my age,
Yeah.
and have exactly my trajectory through this shit, kind of. So I don't know. I'm always interested in how it looks, and you're identifying already a change that is happening over the course of your life, taking this work seriously.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the same trajectory that I've identified on a different scale. But there's a way in which it all feels like a post-apocalypse to me.
Yes.
The logic of the whole like independent artist internet now is so captured and dehumanizing compared to how it felt in 2008 or whatever.
Yeah, and it's like in 2008 I was 7 years old, so I don't even remember. I have some understanding of what it was like then because I've read a lot of wonderful webcomics that are like from around that time, and I've seen the things people have written about it, like how things used to be and how things changed. But it is funny to see people talk about the medium that I work in as if it were like kind of dead before I even got there. And not even that I think that that's an incorrect assessment, because I think that it is post-apocalyptic in terms of like a certain way of doing things. And I'm not going to pretend like the environment that I make art, as an independent artist on the internet, like that it's good, or that I like it, or that I that it is like the way that I would like things to be. But I also have to be sort of like realistic about it, because I have, hopefully, ideally, sort of a whole career of making art ahead of me. And I'm just going to have to kind of deal with the way things are instead of, kind of imagining the way that I would like things to be. But I always think about like I always think about Tony Soprano in The Sopranos when he says, it's good to be in something from the ground floor, but lately I'm getting the feeling that I came in at the end. The best is over. And it's hard not to feel like that sometimes about webcomics. And I was gonna say sort of like I sort of want to, I guess, like present a history of like my understanding of, like what my journey has been, I guess, into like getting into webcomics and like where I've ended up.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, continue.
I mean, there's ways in which it has always felt bleak, and it's not going to be a simple trajectory, you know, and it's now, I mean, the big material shift is that there is the way that the internet occupies people's life is much bigger, and there's a lot more people on it, and there are a lot of people who are very invested in your particular weird aggressive project.
Yes.
And like there's something, I mean, you are obviously encouraged in it enough to commit to it to the extent that you have, you know, you have fucking momentum in it. I can't think that it's, I don't really mean a post-apocalypse, you know?
Yes.
A lot of this is like I'm teaching a class, a webcomics class, which is hilarious, for the past like 2 years now. And that has induced me to, I can't be totally negative about it if I'm trying to interface with like undergraduate age people about what this shit looks like and what it could look like.
Yeah.
And, you know, I am still encouraged that it is a place for committed independent work. And you obviously are too, to the extent that you're fucking doing this thing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately,
that's the thing you can hold on to. That is
the thing that I can hold on to. I mean, yeah, because ultimately, as much as I sort of like resent the internet in a lot of ways, and I think that is very clear from a lot of my work too, it's also art that wouldn't exist without the internet, is about the internet. Most of, you know, my main webcomic that I do. And like, I don't know that I would have ever like found an audience without, you know, the internet, without, you know, Twitter and Tumblr and all that. Because like, I mean, I've tried to like sell zines in person, and people really only buy them if they already know who I am from online. And I make much more money via the internet than I ever have like trying to like send people zines in the mail or like, you know, tabling at zine. I've tabled at Zine Fest twice, and both times I lost money.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the norm.
That is probably the norm. Yeah, because that's the thing too. As much as, you know, it's easy to engage in doomerism about the internet and webcomics, it's also like comics have always been sort of a marginalized medium. It's never been easy to sort of like make a living in comics or like maintain an art practice in comics. Like it's never been like the most like respected or prestigious or lucrative thing to do, and like that's okay. And ultimately, I do it because I love it. And because other people, at least to some extent, want to see it. And even if like I don't make a lot of money doing it, that's okay. It's not really what I set out expecting anyway. Yeah.
I mean, it's marginal and it's cheap, and a lot of the ways that we do it are built around, you know, exploiting industrial processes in the cheapest way possible.
Yes.
But the dynamics are very different if we're an independent artist as opposed to if we are, you know, an artist being exploited by a publisher, you know?
Yeah.
If you're an independent artist doing your committed thing, then like a relatively small number of committed, interested readers is a fucking career, you know?
Yeah.
That's probably still true in some sort of way if you can mobilize that in a certain way.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. It's like, I don't know. Yeah. When I mean, I've been, you know, interested in webcomics for a really long time. I probably first started reading webcomics when I was like 11 or 12. And when I was that age and like into my teens, the landscape was still largely that like somebody would make a comic and they would post it either onto like a personal website or onto, I think a lot of the aggregator websites that people used to use, like KeenSpot and stuff, had already died out by the time I was reading webcomics. But like Comic Fury existed. I remember reading Dropout by Grateful Lee on Comic Fury, or stuff that had its own website, like Crow Killers. And I also read a lot of older webcomics, some really great, some pretty crappy.
Crow Killers, I can see absolutely there's an aesthetic.
Yeah.
I can see why that would jive with you.
Yeah, I think that like Kate Wirtz's work on Crow Killers and her other stuff, that was a big thing for me. And just in terms of like looking at a comic and being like, oh, I could do this. And like, this is something that's possible for me, because I obviously like, there's a particular vibe to the stuff that I do. And I don't make like super beautiful, aesthetically accomplished work. And it was an important step to me to be like, well, I don't have to do that. I don't have to draw like, because I think a thing that was going on when I was a teenager was there were a lot of comics in the space by people who were sort of using their webcomic as almost like a portfolio or like calling card for their like theoretical future art career. The hope of like, oh, I went to art school and now I make this webcomic and like hopefully, I'll get work
Yeah.
as a storyboard artist or whatever off of this. Um, and which is funny because which I think some people were hostile to that shift, but it's like that dream has also kind of died, because the animation industry
Yeah.
is in the spot that it's in, which seems to be like clearly not good, even as someone with obviously no insider experience of that. And then something that happened in my adult life was I think like it became popular, I guess, in my adult life. It might have happened a little earlier. I'm fuzzy on the exact, parameters of this, but like stuff like Tapas and Webtoon, where it is sort of these big like corporate homes for webcomics, and it's sort of like webcomics for the mainstream, as opposed to webcomics being for people with kind of like niche interests. Like it used to be to like using the internet itself was a very niche interest, and then like being interested in comics on the internet was still a very niche interest, and now it's sort of broadened. And then obviously
Yeah.
there's the whole thing of like the Webtoon original, where like they have some deal, which seems very financially exploitative to me, but they have some deal with, the person who draws and writes the webcomic, where, they get paid a certain amount and they have to put out X amount, and then Webtoon or Tapas or whatever, like they promote those comics. Something I've noticed about Webtoon, because I've tried to look at it and be like, what's the deal with Webtoon? It's you can't go to Webtoon and just you can't like sort by new and just see like random comics that somebody posted somewhere in the world. You are only served the stuff that they want you to see that is already popular. And if you want to read something with a small readership that is very niche, you would have to like, I think, just get a link to it directly from that artist's sort of like social media presence.
Yeah, or like really, really dig through the genre sorted
Yeah. Yeah.
chunks of it or
But it's
whatever.
very hostile to like the reader finding anything like, new and unpopular, which is
Hmm.
bad. I mean, obviously, like I'm sure there's good work being done on Webtoon and on websites like that, but it does seem like totally antithetical to what I found interesting about webcomics and what I find interesting about webcomics, which is just that like anybody can do it and you don't need a lot of resources. You don't need permission from anybody. There's no like substantial gatekeeping. Um, and there are no sort of like guidelines on like what you can or can't do. And that's not the way that it is with Webtoon. Webtoon also has like content guidelines for its artists about like, nudity and violence and stuff. There's stuff that you can and can't post on Webtoon.
Right.
So they're not just like a neutral platform in the way that, relatively speaking, Comic Fury is. As far as Comic Fury's content guidelines go, it seems like basically as long as you don't post anything illegal or like violate copyright in some very blatant way, like literally just, reposting a pirated comic that was originally published some other way, that, they won't kick you off and you won't get in trouble for, making a comic that's like just about whatever.
I was going to say that the sort of received wisdom in a lot of thinking and talking about this that I have encountered is that generally this space has become a lot more professionalized, and the platform thing is a part of that. But people feel pressure to have their work look a certain way, be palatable, and interface in some, even if theoretical, some sort of way with like more formal comics or animation industries. You're identifying a strong adherence to the opposite of
Yes.
that, which is exciting to hear, and which you can see in. I'm sorry if this sounds rude, but you can see it in your work.
Yeah.
It's technically very. You know what you're doing, but it's not doing a flashy, polished thing.
No, I mean, a lot of that
So
is
it's exciting to hear.
is genuinely like I don't know how to do that. I didn't go to art school. I have never held like a professional arts job. I'm currently an usher at a movie theater part-time.
Hmm.
And so it doesn't feel like, I don't know. I guess also it's like if I wanted to make a mainstream piece of art, if I wanted to make the same kind of comic as like a comic book that somebody could buy at the store, like for me, I just think like what the fuck would be the point of that? Because like then they could just go buy that thing from somebody who's better at making sort of like friendlier, more palatable, more polished art than I am. And like there is a place for that kind of thing, but it's not the kind of work that I'm good at making. And I don't think that I could compete with it even if I wanted to, and I don't really want to. I think that like what makes webcomics
Yeah.
special is the fact that you don't have to be that kind of artist to do it. And I think I always like I feel, I guess, a certain hostility towards people who are more credentialed, which is a little unwarranted. Like everybody's just doing their thing, everybody's just making art. But I think I'm always going to have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder of like, yeah, I make stuff that's kind of weird and ugly and unpleasant. But it's just like that's the kind of art that I feel driven to make.
Right, and you want to. I mean, I understand. I understand that judgmental feeling. But you want to leave the polished, palatable art to the people who are obsessively driven to make that exact polished, palatable art. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
The dream is that we're all in some way clear on what we want to specifically do and have some framework to approach it.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm not against comics like that existing, but it's sort of like, I don't want to do that. And I also hope to not be in a creative landscape where that is like considered like the end all be all of comics, where like doing something other than that is considered a failure. But also it's like, it doesn't matter if people consider what I do a failure or not, because it's like, well, I make it and some proportion of people do read it. So on that count, it's a success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a healthy and kind of unusual way of looking at it. Honestly, there's this pervasive attitude of now that English language webtoon platform launched in 2014. I don't know exactly how long it took for it to be like the enormous force that it is now.
Yeah.
But that shift to me has felt like a just sort of like narrowing of horizons, or like a capturing of people's images of what a career in comics can be. And it's depressing. And I mean, again, I don't want to. People should try to do whatever they want and make a career in whatever way works for them.
Yeah.
But it's sad. It's sad that it's not really on people's radar to think in terms of like building their own thing and building audience attention in the particular way that they're interested in doing their work, and like making some sort of a career or part of a career out of that, as opposed to just like trying to get a fucking job with webtoons.com.
Right. Yeah. It's like, I don't know. I'm not, it's like I'm an artist and I'm not like a temporarily embarrassed IP holder or storyboard artist or professional in some other capacity. Like I do the thing that I do because I think it's worthwhile in and of itself, not because I want it to theoretically lead to some other thing that's more lucrative or more respectable. And it's funny, I had for a while, it's funny, my policy is normally never to mention this because I feel like talking about it usually makes it worse, but I don't think anybody, there's like a forum thread of like people making fun of me on a website devoted to that kind of thing. Just sort of like, gossiping and saying nasty things about like people on the internet, especially trans people, but a lot of artists too. And at this point, like I've mostly made my peace with it, of just like, if you're the kind of person who sits around all day and posts in a forum about how you like hate some guy in Chicago who like works as a theater usher and lives in an attic, like it feels like it's a them problem. But something that struck me was like the lens through which these people viewed my work, of like the ways in which they were insulting it, of like, oh, this person could never get a Webtoons original deal. This person could never work as a storyboard artist. And they're talking about that like I think that they think that I don't know that, or that like they cannot broaden their horizons even to the extent where like they are capable of imagining that I would ever want something else, or that I would ever make the art that I do for another reason. And it was so weird. Yeah. It's just like, God, that's sad.
Like God, like where were all these people? These people were just like desperate for some fucking authority to cling to in this space for all these years before there was something like Webtoons. And I guess they still existed. I mean, before, like 10, 15 years ago, the thing was, there was a fixation on like, you're not a real artist if you're not selling your work.
Yeah.
You're not a real artist if you're giving it away for free and selling merchandise or whatever. You won't be a real artist until you're published by this or that platform. It's the same logic.
Yeah.
It's Well, anyway, it's absolutely a them problem.
Yeah.
That's fucking
Yeah,
infuriating.
it is also sort of like a thing that complicates like being an artist on the internet is this sort of it's funny. I feel like I used to be, when I started making webcomics, I was very enthusiastic about the idea of being sort of like a small time public figure on the internet. And like, I don't know, I wasn't much younger then, but I was younger and I had a different outlook on these things. And I think like I wanted like the social power that I imagined that would give me. And now that like, my comic does have a readership and people on the internet do, at least in some sort of small niche circles, know who I am, it's sort of become increasingly stressful. And I'm someone who I think is, I don't know, I engage with my audience, but I don't, I'm not trying to like, I don't know, like build a cult of personality around myself. And I'm not like, I don't know, uploading lots of videos with me like talking. And this is I've really like mostly stopped posting pictures of my face on the internet altogether. I've just been like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want that to be a part of how people see me. I just want them to like see the art that I make. And there are a lot of people I see who are like discussing the pressure to like be an internet personality and like upload videos to TikTok. And it's just like I've come to terms with the fact where I'm just like, I'm not like hot and charismatic enough to do that. I feel like that's a weird thing to expect of a cartoonist. I feel like I would usually associate cartoonists. I feel like it's not weird for me to be a little bit antisocial, I guess.
Good to be intentional about that. That's nice.
Yeah.
This is shit that you're like explicitly focusing on in great length in the text of what happens next.
Yeah, because
these exact sorts of questions.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, because there's something kind of horrifying about just like living in this like weird panopticon where like sort of, you put all this stuff about yourself out into the world and you're encouraged to do that to engage with other people. But at any time you could be, surveilled. People could be screenshotting this and making fun of you or sending it to your boss. It's sort of like the destruction of the private life, or I guess the dissolution of the boundary between the public and the private life. The way that like, there are like content creators, so to speak, on the internet who will, like photograph or film people who are just like walking around in the world going about their business. And it's just like, what a weird way to live. And like, we've all sort of, I guess like at least people my age have all sort of accepted like, yeah, this is just the way everything is. And I just sort of sitting here like, but doesn't it suck? Don't we hate it? I don't know. I mean,
horrifying.
I don't know. I have a love-hate relationship with the internet because it's connected me so much to other people and like brought me to like some of the most important relationships of my life. It's allowed me to engage with art in a way that like I might not have been able to otherwise. And just like it when I was sort of like a lonely teenager, it was like, oh, there's a whole world out there that I can like access. And that was great. And sometimes it still is great, but there are other sort of very negative things about it. And it's funny. I think that a lot of art that's being made now, although certainly by no means all of it, is kind of backwards looking and kind of doesn't want to engage with the internet and like the huge place that it takes up in people's lives, because there's this idea that it's just like, I don't know, depressing and unexciting, and that like internet culture is like not worth cataloging or documenting or making art about. And some of the reason that I like started making What Happens Next and started, making art about like Tumblr and stuff is just like, this mattered and it happened and I was there. And just sort of doing that bare minimum of acknowledging the internet and acknowledging social media as like a force of significance in my life and in the lives of people around me.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. I have thought about that too. I wonder if a part of it is because it's so fresh and high context that it's easy to get really obnoxiously wrong.
Yes.
Like in What Happens Next, it seems to like depend on an extremely high literacy or maybe not depend on, but it demonstrates an extremely high literacy in like Tumblr culture in a way that if you weren't literate in that, I could see being quite obnoxious. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's funny, right? It is the paradox of like, if I want to make something that speaks to people who are like me in this sort of very specific way, then there is always sort of the risk of like alienating people who do not live in that world and who do not know anything about it. And also another fundamental problem with making art about the internet is that the internet like changes all of the time very quickly, and the online of when I was a teenager is not the online of now already, and the online of 4 years ago when I started the comic is not the online of now. And it's funny because sometimes I'll be referencing Tumblr screenshots, and it's funny. One thing I decided was like, if Tumblr changes their interface, I'm going to use the new version instead of the old version. And if they change it again, I'll change it again, because I could like, use Wayback Machine pages or whatever and like only reference what it used to look like in 2014 or only reference what it used to look like in 2021. But it's more interesting. I think my approach to like, oh, the internet's changing all the time in my work has just been like, well, I'm just going to like let it change and let my comic exist in this sort of like loose floating timeline. And then when the comic is done, it'll be this like weird geologic record of like how everything became different from the way it was at the start, the way that you can like, I don't know, like cut open a tree and like count the rings or like look at layers of sediment in the ground. But it is sort of like something that requires a particular approach that not everybody is interested in taking.
Yeah. I wanted to specify that, though. I wanted to draw this distinction that like the comic with Tumblr in particular, I feel like the comic, it has a high degree of like literacy in like Tumblr culture, and it presents all the things very accurately and believably. But I think because it's such a, character focused emotive thing, that sort of literacy is not necessarily needed by the reader,
Yeah, that's what I hope, is that somebody who has no familiarity or very low familiarity with all or some of this stuff can still engage with the work on like a character level, an emotional level, because like I think of myself as like a very character first writer. And I'm certainly not like, if I wanted to write a history of the internet or a history of Tumblr, then I would just do that. But I'm also making a comic about like characters and like feelings and interaction. And it was just interesting to me to, I guess, sort of like set it in like this very like logged on world, because like that is the milieu that I came out of and that a lot of my friends came out of. And that I think a lot of like transgender people especially wind up existing within, particularly in my age bracket. And it was sort of like, I want to write about how this stuff affects people as people and how it affects like the way that they live their lives. It also gave me an excuse to draw a comic with a lot of like people sitting on chairs or sitting at desks, and not a lot of action or movement, which I'm not so good at drawing.
So I want to talk a little bit about the particular format of like totally separate pages. You're not doing like a page composed of panels. You're doing entirely discrete, separate images, one page after another of the same size. Wherefore?
Yes.
How do you arrive at that?
Yeah, there are sort of two answers to that question, and part of it is like, I was briefly a media and cinema studies student. I really liked film. I liked the idea of, and still like the idea of like having a panel that's sort of like a shot in a movie where it's like just this sort of like discrete image that I can focus in on. I like the amount of detail that it allows me to include, especially like in backgrounds and just like all these little like greebles of just having the one big panel instead of having to, kind of shrink it down to fit on a page. Of course, I could make like infinitely large pages, and there are webcomic artists who just have these huge pages that you have to like scroll through. But that wasn't really like, that's not really something that I wanted to do. I guess I prefer the way that I do it. And then it kind of gives people the option if they want to click through it in the more traditional way, or if they want to like read it in scroll view, they can do that too.
Do you have that set up on the Comic Fury site as a scroll? Oh my God.
Yeah, you can actually like click to view it in scroll view. I never do that. I actually just, whenever I read back through my own comic to like, for consistency's sake, for like, tone, or to keep up with like whatever I've established before, I'll go read back through it. And I never use the scroll view, but a lot of people really like it. And I think it's nice to give them that option. Although the other answer to like, why do I do panels the way I do panels is literally just that when I first started out, I didn't really know how to make a page layout in the conventional sense digitally. I do now, I've since learned. But like I literally didn't know how. And I was like, well, I could wait around and like figure out how and like maybe lose motivation to work on this thing. Or I could just do this the only way that I know how to do it and start immediately.
Hell yeah.
And I'm always kind of erring on the side of like, how can I remove? It's very hard. I'm the kind of person, I have a lot of problems with doing anything, like just like waking up in the morning and getting out of bed and like brushing my teeth. And to make art, I'm always kind of coming out of the mindset of like, how can I remove as many barriers as possible between me thinking of the thing and me making the thing? And the nice thing about not having page layouts is that like I just like think of an image in my head and then I draw that image and then there it is. And I thumbnail sometimes for sequences that are a little bit more complicated, but for what happens next, I usually don't thumbnail at all or have any kind of like pre-visualization process. I just like write my script and then I sit down and I start drawing.
Cool. It's a really
And yeah.
I'm sorry, you keep going.
I was gonna say, and I literally just like release the comic as fast as I can draw it, usually in collections of like 4 to 8 panels, or sometimes more panels, depending on how quickly I get them done and how I think they fit together.
Why is the urgency?
Yeah, I think it is just like the having it out there for people to respond to is like motivating. Although sometimes it can be stressful too to like post something and think like, how are people gonna react to this? I don't know. But I think it's just like, yeah, I like to make it simple for myself, I guess, and just like think of the thing and then do the thing and then post the thing, and then it's done and I move on. And I think the more time that I give myself to kind of like, I don't want to like ruminate too much, and I want to just kind of like go, I don't know, sort of like go with my gut on certain things because I just feel like that's how I personally end up being the most productive.
Cool. I like it. It's interesting to see the format wise. I think it interfaces nicely with the comics' attention on like false document presentation of internet stuff because we're
That too,
there's
yeah.
this feeling
The
of
panel
always
by panel
looking at a
approach.
screen. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives me like the space to be like, oh, I can just include like a drawing of like a screenshot of a website and I can just like, kind of fit that in there. Whereas if I had to shrink it down to fit in a panel, I actually did do like a version of the first chapter, Dog Names, that I printed as a zine. And I like fit it into a traditional comics page format. And that was an interesting exercise and I think it came out okay. But I certainly was like, I came out of being like, I certainly would not want to do this for the entire comic, good Lord. Because it gets really hard to like fit like a Skype interface or a Zoom interface into a panel if you have to like put multiple panels on a page, or like just like a screenshot of somebody's Tumblr or whatever.
It doesn't feel. I mean, it feels natively like the way that it is. Have you seen those hardcover Homestuck collections?
Yeah, I think they suck. I think that was like the exact kind of thing where I was like, I don't want to do that.
Doesn't.
I want to do, and I love Homestuck, but it's like that's just not a good format to read it in. It's not how it was meant to be seen.
Yeah, it does not. It doesn't work. I agree. It's
yeah,
like you can see why it was a very popular comic. They want to make the book of it, but they want the idea of the book is it's in some way definitive, and that's the thing is so built into being looked at through a browser that it doesn't doesn't work at all.
And that was like what was exciting to me about Homestuck when I read Homestuck, because I don't know, like a lot of comics about like teenagers especially are about like, going to school and like going out and doing stuff. And obviously Homestuck has all of these like crazy fantasy elements, but it's also a lot of like just people sitting at their computer typing. And it's like, that was how I talked to my friends. I would just like, type out like paragraphs to them in like Facebook Messenger or whatever, and like have these long conversations. And it was cool to see a comic that felt like that, and that felt like specific to that experience. And I feel like putting it in a book is like, well, now it's a book, but it's also like nobody's ever like, it's not an ideal way to read the comic for the first time. It's like a little bit confusing, and it feels like the Homestuck book serves more as like a collectible curiosity for people who already like the comic, and it's not really a good entry point into the comic if you've never read it before. And like it's kind of a fine thing to like have and to sell. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I don't think that I would ever want to print What Happens Next in part because I feel like it would turn out like that, and that's just not really something that I'm interested in selling to people.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I
Yeah.
like have deliberately thought about the book format, and that's like encoded into my entire approach from the
Yeah.
jump.
Yeah, I think you have to.
So
Yeah.
like otherwise, it would not make sense to me conceptually in the way that you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I was gonna say too, it's funny. This is sort of like a little side tangent, but I also like I don't sell merchandise for my comic, even though like theoretically I could, and I might make some money that way. And people have asked me like, "Oh, do you want to sell stuff like stickers or T-shirts or whatever?" And the thing that I keep running up against is often the profit margins are bad, like on stickers. Like they cost me a certain amount to print, and I can only really sell a sticker for so much unless I want to like way overcharge people, which I don't really want to do. And then in terms of like print on demand t-shirts and like enamel pins and keychains, part of it is like I don't really feel great about like taking part in sort of like, you know, using like exploited labor. You know, it's like I don't know who made this t-shirt or who made this keychain. I didn't make it myself. And I don't know where it comes from. And it's like, you know, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, blah, blah, blah. But it's like I don't want to be a participant in that supply chain and I don't want to profit off of it. And then there's also the other thing of just like I don't like the idea that like I don't like the idea of just like selling stuff to people of just like trinkets and junk that they have in their house because like that's not how I conceive of my art and my characters. It feels like everybody really admires like Bill Watterson for like, you know, making a choice not to merchandise Calvin and Hobbes, but then a lot of people don't really want to act on that. And I don't know that I necessarily like. I don't think it diminishes a comic necessarily to sell merchandise of it. Like I own a Crow Killers T-shirt, and it's like I treasure it. I love that T-shirt, but I don't know. It's not something I want to do because I don't think my work was meant to exist in that context. And sometimes people are confused by that.
Yeah, well, a part of the Bill Watterson thing is that that's a reasonable move for the Calvin and Hobbes guy to do because he was paid paid a good rate as a syndicated cartoonist, right?
That's true.
So there's that.
Yeah. And as an indie artist, sometimes there isn't really like that is the most viable way to monetize your work.
So, I mean, do you have a sense that like the readership that you have is you wrote this thing in the notes about how the challenge of writing something kind of quote unquote literary fiction adjacent for an audience of people who mostly engage with art via fandom.
Yeah.
Is that what is the world that you're talking to? I mean, how does your readers' literacy in these spaces translate to you?
That's a great question. I sometimes like feel like I sort of don't know who the intended audience is, or like who am I writing this for, and how do I want people to react to it exactly? But
intended, I don't know if intended is even
right.
the question.
It's sort of like
who are they?
Yeah, the actual audience, I guess. I think that obviously, like a lot of people who write webcomics are writing genre work, which again, like I don't dislike that. Or it's either genre work usually or like slice of life type stuff, which it's not always the case. But I feel like there are relatively few webcomics that are like just about like people doing stuff that could basically be done in real life. And my comic is like sort of like crime fiction adjacent, but it doesn't really have any other obvious genre elements besides that. And I think that there is a degree to which people are not who read webcomics are like not used to engaging with the kind of work that I do, especially because like I have a very cartoony art style in What Happens Next. I sometimes draw differently for other comics or in my free time, more so now than I used to. But I think that when people think of like a serious comic about people, about interpersonal drama, you know, they're probably imagining some shit that looks like Daniel Clowes or Clowes. I can never remember how to say his name, but you know, and like I love comics like that, but that's just not how I draw. And I think sometimes
they're imagining also that it's like a prestige hardcover graphic
right,
novel,
exactly,
not a little webcomic.
Yeah, and I think when people imagine webcomics, they're imagining, you know, stuff about like gamers on a couch or like people working at a little shop together, or they're imagining stuff about like magical girls and wizards and like demons. And my webcomic isn't really any of that stuff. So I think sometimes people are like at a loss for like how to engage with it, which is like fine. It's fine to like do something a little different. It's also fine that, you know, I'm glad that like, I hope that like, you know, some people who read my webcomic for whom it is kind of a branching out, like I hope that they can, you know, appreciate that and go on to read other sorts of comic or other sorts of, you know, writing that's different than the stuff they usually engage with. And I guess like in terms of like fandom engagement, it's like my characters are not really like, it's funny because there is something kind of like cutesy about the what happens next art style, and that it's very simplified and everybody's got like big eyes and heads. But there's also things that are kind of like ugly and unpleasant about it, where it's like, yeah, I draw people that are like fat and have acne and have like badly dyed hair. And they're not character designs that are like meant to like go on a t-shirt, and they're not meant to be like aspirational figures of fantasy for the reader. They just kind of are what they are, and they exist in the context that they exist in. And I think people who are used to engaging with work through fandom of characters who are supposed to be these aspirational figures, who are supposed to be marketable and merchandisable, I think people who have like kind of only read art like that or only engaged with art like that, especially like younger people, like sometimes they read my comic and they find it upsetting or confusing in certain ways. And then I think my least favorite kind of audience reaction, something that I struggle with a lot, is people who will kind of react to the things happening as the comic as if they are simply like real, and if they are as if they're like reading like a Tumblr call out post Google Doc that's just like enumerating the actions of real people. And they feel like their job when reading the comic is to decide like who's in the right and who's in the wrong, and to like litigate the facts of it. And it's like, well, none of this happened. It's art, and I made it up, and I made everything this way on purpose.
Yeah, so in reading through it, I want to pinpoint that exact thing. In reading through it, I read a bunch of the comments. It seems like a fairly wide-reaching and extremely engaged audience that is on your designated website engaging with the thing, which is fucking cool to see and a little unusual, I feel like, to see.
Yeah.
But I have seen that weird judgment thing, and it is fascinating to me that the comic itself, maybe this is my particular area of interest in it, but the comic itself, you seem very interested in like questions of guilt and complicity and how various people and systems unilaterally judge people.
Yeah.
But then the fucking people are doing that too. Your readers are sometimes doing that too.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard.
And these are not even real people. To leave that to even leave that aside.
Yeah, and it's like they are. Yeah, it's like you guys know that I made this all up, and it's like fine, right? And yeah, I think. Yeah, those are like definitely questions that I'm wrestling with as an artist, and like I think part of the reason that like the particular social culture of Tumblr was interesting to me is that it is sort of this like petri dish little version of like society, of like, and like these ideas. I think a lot of people will like sort of use like internet drama and arguments and disputes to sort of like work out their larger ideas about morality and the world, and like what do we do with people when they've done something bad? How are we supposed to react to it? You know, like when is forgiveness warranted, and when does something else need to happen? You know, and it's sort of this like sort of question that I'm always thinking about, but that I don't necessarily like feel like I have the answer to. And then I was also thinking about like, as I really like crime fiction, and I really like, you know, I don't know, like detective movies or whatever, and like thrillers and stuff like that. But there's always this underlying of assumption of like crime is done generally by evil people who then, you know, and then justice is served by them being punished. And it's this worldview of like, it counts as recompense for something bad happening if somebody is punished for it, even though, you know, like in the context of the comic, like, Griffin went to prison, but like that doesn't mean that like Haley is not dead. Like it doesn't undo what's been done. It doesn't like really make anybody's life better necessarily. It maybe like prevents something. It maybe prevents further bad things from happening. But it's just sort of this like idea of like, yeah, when this, I guess like I wanted to interrogate that idea of like, yeah, justice is when somebody gets punished, and when something bad happens to somebody. And it's like I don't know how I feel about that. And I think also in terms of like writing characters who I never want to be writing the kind of comic where like the characters just agree with me, the writer, all the time, and they just say whatever I would say in the best way that I could say it. And even when characters are saying something that I agree with, I try my best to make them, say something kind of dumb or like something that shows how they're limited in their in their own worldview. Like in Aaron's argument with Claire about about Haley and all of that. I broadly agree with Aaron, but I tried not to make Aaron like articulate themselves super well or say all the things that I would want to say, because ultimately I'm still just like telling a story about characters. And I want to I never want to be like bashing the audience over the head with like what I think, because I don't think that the art that I don't think my art is like, super politically meaningful. I don't set out to change people's minds. I always think about that Kurt Vonnegut quote of like every reasonable artist was, against the Vietnam War, and the effect of that was like custard pie being dropped from a stepladder. And I think that's kind of like the vast majority of artists.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. The first episode of the show I did was with Casey
God, that's
Green.
Right.
And we talked about that exact
He says
quote.
the exact same quote, yeah. But
I mean, it's evocative.
Yeah, I mean, I think we live in an era where people have sort of, I mean, maybe this has never not been true, but that people have sort of political expectations of artists. I think, especially as a queer person, there's a very strong pressure to make art about trans people that is somehow like, and gay people and so forth, that is like good for the cause and like inspiring change. And it's like, not only like do I not want to do that, I don't even think that I can. So yeah, that's, I guess, I'm not writing an ideological polemic, but sometimes I feel like people want me to, which is weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's people want a specific claim to be struck,
Yeah.
And I mean, you said that thing about what's the character's name, the one you're sympathetic
Aaron.
to? Aaron. You said this. You tried to present them as complicated and somewhat compromised, even if you agree with them in that particular argument. But it is interesting that like I latched on to them as a, sympathetic and really like clear-headed character. Like I have it in my head. I when I read a thing, I'm desperate to see an ambiguous sort of show don't tell exploratory project like how you're identifying your approach. But I found myself just latching on to like, oh, this is the statement being made.
Yeah, I mean,
I see the pull of that.
Yeah, I think that like to some extent, I'm always going to like be skewed towards the characters who are more like me, who maybe agree with me more ideologically. But I try to like give a fair amount of weight to like the characters that I kind of think suck or like who I don't agree with on things. Like I don't think that it's funny because like, I guess like I tried to leave room in like Claire's character or even in more minor characters like Milo's dad, where it's like, I would not like this person if I knew them. I probably don't agree with them on most things, but they are like a human being with feelings. And I never want to write a character as like a one-dimensional asshole or monster because I don't like agree with the way they live in the world, because that's just not like how people really are. And the truth is that like sometimes people that I broadly agree with on a lot of things kind of suck in other ways. And sometimes people who I think are like, bad human beings overall have like redeeming or positive qualities, or like they're more complicated or nuanced than how I might initially see them, which is sort of like, yeah, I don't know. I think I always try to, I'm not super interested in writing about like archetypes, I guess. Like that's certainly one way of approaching character. And I don't think it's the wrong way to approach character, but I am always trying to sort of like construct a vision of an individual that like acts in certain ways, which I guess is why a lot of my work is about people just like making bad choices and doing the wrong thing and saying the wrong thing. I guess I also think that like I don't know, yeah, I don't want to write like role models either, because I think that bleeds too much into like I don't want to tell the reader what to do. And I also, I don't know, I'm not really interested in making art that like makes people feel good about themselves. That's like mostly not the kinds of art that I'm interested in consuming. So it's not the kind of art that I'm interested in creating. I like watching a movie or reading a book or reading a comic and feeling kind of like gross and uncomfortable. I guess it's sort of like a safe way to experience those feelings about stuff that's not real. And I also feel kind of, I guess, like vindicated in my own experiences of like the weird and terrible world And it's like, okay, I'm not the only one this is happening to, or I'm not the only one who sees this. And I think that like that can be a powerful emotion that art can create as well. Just this feeling of like, oh, I know I've also encountered this type of person, or I've felt this type of feeling, or like this type of thing has happened in my life or to somebody I know.
I think, I mean, kind of, it feels like kind of just good writing practice to think in these terms. Like it's a it's an application of the show don't tell principle,
Yeah.
right? Like exploring a space ideologically and making like, giving dimension to characters that even if you don't agree with them or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, what was I going to say? I feel like, within certain political frameworks, it's maybe easier than other ones to like totally write off a person.
Yeah. I have like
Or something,
some,
or to like think of the people around you as archetypes.
yeah.
You know?
I have some ideological commitment to not doing that, I guess, or I like to think that I do. I don't think that I don't have a worldview that really allows for people who are like 100% terrible all of the time. Even though like there are people whose like total effect on the world is basically 100% terrible, I don't think that they were like always doomed to be that way, or that like that's necessarily the only way they can be. I don't know. I think that like uh I think that there's a pretty I think that the way that people like sometimes think about evil in the world is just like there's bad people who do bad stuff who are just like fundamentally not like me and the people that I love. And it's like, I don't know. The truth that I think is that like everybody is capable of doing good and bad things, and a lot of it depends on like circumstance and like the kind of life that they have and the kind of like choices that are placed in front of them, and that maybe we all have like a little bit less free will than we like to think we do. And I guess that's the kind of that's also just the kind of stuff that I write about, where it's like, yeah, I don't know, that's just like the way that I think about the world, and so that's how I make art.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I can see that. It's not polemical, but that's in
Right.
your comic, absolutely. But it's interesting how much attention there seems to be in the comic on like cultural spaces where these judgments are made really harshly. You have like the sort of the right wing, the sister of the murdered girl who's on this like punitive crusade.
Yeah, Claire.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm fascinated by this idea of like punishment and writing people off and stuff. It's something that I have thought about and worked through in my own work in extremely different ways. So it's cool to see. Do you feel like, I mean, do your readers get what you're going for?
I think sometimes some proportion of people do. I think a lot of the time people don't, and that can frustrate me and bum me out. But I've seen like other webcomic artists over time kind of go through the path of like trying to like wrestle with their audience for control over how their work is seen. And I think that that's like a losing battle to fight, and usually like the artist does not come out of that looking good. And so I have to accept that like people are going to take away things from my work that I didn't intend. They're going to say things about it that I don't agree with, or have interpretations of it that were, not what I wanted, I guess. And like the Claire stuff was a big like locus of that I found very frustrating when I was writing that chapter, of people being like, I don't understand why what she's doing is bad. And it's like, if you don't understand why it's bad, then like I kind of can't help you. And that's kind of the thing where it's like the art is just the art. And I think when I put something out into the world for other people, I kind of relinquish control over it. And if I really wanted to have nobody ever misunderstand my work, then I would just have to never show it to anybody. And there are like a small proportion of people who seem to like understand what I'm doing, and take something away from it. And I just have to kind of be satisfied with that.
I wonder, like, the thing it makes me wonder is what do you think it is that interests the people that fundamentally don't get what you're going for?
I think that like I don't know, like people watch a lot of like YouTube videos about like internet drama and forum drama of like, oh, people did or said this crazy thing, this person on Tumblr who stole bones or whatever. And I think the stuff that I write about is like close enough to the real thing that it attracts people who are sort of just like car crash rubberneckers for that kind of sort of mundane unhappiness. Um, and it's like, I kind of understand where they're coming from, right? Because if I didn't have an interest in that stuff, I probably wouldn't have written this comic. And I'm coming at it from a position of like, I'm interested by this because I'm interested in how other people live and what their lives are like and the weird ways they act and the weird ways they feel. But I don't feel like disgust for those people or like anger at them. It's more this feeling of like, oh, there, but for the grace of God go I. Like everybody could be laughing at me on the internet. And I think that some people like don't see that dimension of it. I think that also like there are people who live lives that are like kind of like Milo's life, where they just like spend a lot of time inside on the computer, like arguing with people on the internet. And there aren't a lot of characters who are written as having those experiences or living life that way. So I think that like there's also a degree to which people who might not get what I'm going for in a greater sense with a comic are like drawn to these individual pieces of it that they find relatable, of like, oh, this is kind of what my day-to-day looks like, or like, I'm also like interested in this thing. Like, I also remember those like My Little Pony fan videos. I think I always worry a little bit that I'm leaning too heavily on like people recognizing like the cultural references or signifiers that I pepper into my work, and that like a lot of people who read my comic are just like, their main enjoyment is just like, oh, I recognize that thing, which is like not what I aspire to do as an artist. But like also the specificity of it is interesting to me. And a lot of what I find enjoyable about art is kind of like constructing a character based on those signifiers. Like, oh, what type of person listens to this kind of music, or what type of person, you know, wears these kinds of clothes or has this kind of hobby. That's something that I'm just kind of like endlessly fascinated by, more than I'm fascinated by like any one interest. Like, it's sort of like I'm more interested in like, I don't know, theoretically, like the type of guy who does woodworking that I am in like the process of woodworking. And like, that's sort of how I am about everything. I just like want to know about types of person that there are in the world.
I mean, I think that's an instructive sort of line of interest. I feel like I can analogize this to my own shit. So I first of all, reading your comic, I suspect that there are a lot of like particular cultural references that I am not totally clued into, but you're driven by something. I analogize this to my own thing. Like Third Voice, the comic I've been doing for 2 years, has an extremely kind of detailed and rigidly constructed fictional setting, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like detail, and there's a lot of little things that people can, and some of them do, pick apart in how it all works and fits together. And it is important to me. It's interesting to me to have it fit together. But all that stuff only counts or only feels valuable if it's detail that's like supportive of character motion and like big narrative ideas. I feel like there's a similar thing that you're kind of identifying, where like the motivating thing is how these little details and references support, you know, what support and communicate what the character is.
Yeah.
And what the story is communicating, you know? So I don't know, that lends to like a stronger structure than just something that, you know, because there are an abundance of things in pop culture where there is no strong structure. It's all just stupid reference shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can see. I don't think that that's what you're doing.
Yeah,
you have a vision, man.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I think I'm very interested in just also sort of like, yeah, like when I'm like putting a poster in a character's room, the message that I'm sending with that poster is not like necessarily like, oh, I like this thing, or I think this thing is cool. And in fact, like there's references to pop culture stuff or internet stuff that I have like no direct experience with, which is funny because sometimes people will ask me questions about like anime or video games, and I'm like, I don't really watch a ton of anime. I certainly don't watch like everything new that comes out, and there are some very popular ones that I've never seen. And I play like 3 video games like ever. And I have like I've never played like, I don't know, somebody was like, oh, like what character would like, when I had the anonymous ask box open. I have it open right now actually because the website I used to do it is shutting down soon. But that's a tangent. Anyway, somebody asked me like, oh, what character would this who would play this character in like Skyrim or whatever. I don't know, some shit like that. And I was like, I've never played Skyrim. I don't know anything about Skyrim. And like when I reference video games in my comic, it's not because I like the video game. It's because I think that I've identified something about the type of person who would play that video game and like the history of like how it got in front of them and like how they grew up, that they would have ended up doing this particular thing or interested in this particular thing.
Do you do a lot of that? I've noticed you in the comments sometimes, like replying to things and making like, quote unquote word of God statements
Yes.
about the circumstances of the characters or whatever. Do you do a lot of like extra textual stuff like that?
Yeah.
Like build the characters out like that?
Yeah, I do tend to like take a lot of like random little notes about the characters. Like I know all their middle names and their parents' names. I know like where they live and like where they're from. And I have these sort of like ideas of like the histories of their lives and like their hobbies and like what music they listen to. I like make little playlists for all of the characters that are half like songs that I think sort of like relate to the character in some way, or just songs that I think the character would like. And I enjoy doing stuff like that. And sometimes I enjoy people asking me about it or talking to me about it. I think sometimes people miss what I'm trying to do by offering them details like that, where like I'll get questions that are like, what's this character's favorite flavor of ice cream? Or like, what would X character think about? And then they say like some TV show I've never heard of that like doesn't feel of relevance to the universe of my work. And so it's like, I think people think that I'm just like offering random factoids because I like factoids, and like there's some truth to that, but it's also like I don't just come up with details for like the sake of details. I don't think that a more detailed work is necessarily better than a less detailed one. It's just sort of like, this is stuff that I sometimes think is useful or interesting to know, and it's like fun to share it with people because I like talking about the stuff that I make.
Mm-hmm. And this is again that sort of details that support a larger idea
Yeah.
framing, I think.
Right. Whereas, like,
I
it doesn't really matter to me what kind of ice cream the characters like because that's not super social. It's more just like personal taste.
Mm-hmm. Like maybe right. It's relevant if it's expressive of something. Yeah, I struggle with this sort of thing. I have sort of arrived at this extremely dogmatic resistance to revealing anything extra textual, basically. Like, I have a lot of this background work for my setting, but I cannot treat it as existing until it is attested in the comic itself, because otherwise I would end up being beholden to all these little details that may not actually fit, you know?
Yeah. No,
So it's interesting to see different attitudes to that, I guess.
yeah, I will say that I've sort of given myself blanket permission to like disregard whatever word of God statements I've made if like I think that something else would work better or it contradicts something else that I want to do. And if anybody ever asks me about
I think
it,
you have to give
yeah,
yourself
it's like
that.
I'm just if anybody's ever like, oh, well, you said that like this character is like from this town and now they're from this town, and it's like, oh, well, I did that so it would work better for the story. Because I think people definitely, again, they get into the mindset of like treating this as if it's like a real thing. And people have like weird detail nitpicks too about like, well, this like, this website wouldn't have been formatted like that during this time, or like people trying to figure out what exact timeline the comic takes place on, like what year everything happens during. When I've said on multiple occasions, like there is no specific year, and I had like left it sort of ambiguous and like a floating timeline on purpose because it gave me more freedom. And I think people forget that it's like, yeah, if something is in the story, then like it's to serve a narrative purpose. And like, I'm less concerned with like, well, how would this really happen? Or what would be the perfectly accurate version of this? Or like, does this incorporate, this or that detail? I don't know.
The modern nerd brain, man.
Yeah. And it's funny, like,
It pervades.
I am a nerd, but I'm just not that kind of nerd. Like, I'm just not interested in like knowing a bunch of trivia about something for the sake of knowing the trivia.
I feel like there is a value that I see to that sort of nerd, and there is a part of me that is that sort of nerd, but I have like, I don't know, qualified or contextualized it for myself.
Yeah.
But I feel a kinship with it, and I feel like it's a type of attention and readership that can be revelatory and productive.
Yeah.
But it also can just be senseless commodification engine. Like it can be the thing that turns the first Star Wars movie into a million different plastic toys.
Right, yeah. Like there can be a good side to it where like, yeah, it's nice when people look at my comics and they like examine the details closely and they don't just like flip through it as quickly as possible and like they remember all of these little factoids about the characters, they remember their names and stuff. Because I think sometimes like they will be rewarded for engaging with the comic more closely and like paying attention to the smaller stuff. But I think it's sort of like, I don't know, I would hope that like it's good to have a balance, but it is nice when people want to know things too. Like I don't hate that categorically.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think I've acquired a little bit of a reputation for being combative or like kind of a stick in the mud about certain stuff. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think when I'm judgmental about my readers or about other people, it's like, well, my judgment thankfully doesn't have a lot of weight in the world. I'm just like a guy. And I feel this weird pressure to be more agreeable than I really am that often I do give into. I don't like, sort of say what I want to say about everything all the time because I don't want to like, lose all my Patreon subscribers. And I just don't experientially want like being on the internet to be people yelling at me all the time. But I also don't want to be like permanently in customer service mode or feel like I have to be super nice to everybody or entertain everything that everybody thinks about my comic. And like, I don't know. It's a weird relationship to have to my audience. Sometimes I feel like we should all know less about each other. Yeah. I guess it's just that like as somebody who is making comics, I notice trends in like other people who make comics and post them on the internet. And a lot of it is that the internet is not currently a very friendly place for like ongoing comics, for like something that people have to, kind of follow and devote their attention span to, because most people now use one of a few social media websites, and most of those social media websites, all of them to some extent, I think, have like an algorithm that, serves you particular content based on what the website thinks that you want to see and not just based on like who you have chosen to follow and whose stuff that you are choosing to look at. And if you don't like go directly to somebody's profile, you're getting shown everything they make kind of like chopped up and out of order. And it's a state of affairs that I think encourages kind of passive consumption on the part of like, the reader or viewer, where like the ideal use case for the social media website in the eyes of the people who run these websites is that somebody is just like passively scrolling and they'll stop to look at something and then they'll keep going because, this is the way to like serve people the maximum amount of ads and like keep them in your app or whatever for the longest. And that's kind of in opposition to what I want to do, which is like to have, this ongoing thing with a plot that I want people to read in order. And I notice a lot of people kind of default to, especially the people who are most popular on social media, cartoonists, they mostly make very short form work, often like autobiographical work or little gag comics. And I don't think that stuff is bad. Some of it is great, and I love looking at it, and I love seeing it. But I think that people feel less motivated to make ongoing work now because there's less of an audience for it, and also because it's, of course, going to demand a lot of time and care on the part of the artists. And there's this question of, like, is anybody going to see this? Does anybody even want to look at it?
Yeah, absolutely. That feels like that feels clear to me. I want to say that even the people doing the low intensity, infrequent things should still have an audience. Like their audience should still be attentive to it and follow it and see all of it that they want to see. It's a
yes, yeah,
but
it's not a great state of affairs for them.
But it is
either.
a systemic thing that discourages exactly the sort of thing that you and I are aiming at creatively, I feel like.
Yeah. And I see a lot of comics, especially like a lot of like autobio stuff that I think is honestly a little bit boring, where it's just like, today I went to the grocery store and I pet my cat. And I think part of the purpose it serves for the artist is like they're just sort of exercising a muscle, like they're just making comics to sort of like, kind of keep their brain in like a making comics mode, so they're doing something, which I respect. And I think that a lot of people are under, they're very tired. They have day jobs, they have stuff to do, and they just want to make like these little comics that they don't have to think too hard about. And there's also an audience who like wants to like sort of glance at something and be like, oh, that's just like my life, and kind of move on, not having thought too hard about it. And I guess I have this feeling like it's easy for me to be like snarky about the work that other people do or put it down because it's not what I find interesting or it's not what I would like to do artistically. But I guess like aside from, the thing of like, well, everybody can do what they want to do and all art is equally valid, blah, blah, blah. There's also just the thing of like, it's not all individual choice that kind of fuels these trends in comics. And I find it helpful to think of like, why do people choose to do this stuff? What are sort of the macro like circumstances of their lives and like of the world around them that causes them to make the work that they make instead of, doing some sort of other thing?
Yeah. But then, like, what do we do? I mean, I guess your and my solution to that is to just take the thing we're doing seriously and try to talk to an audience that is interested and attentive to it in a way that is out of fashion. And those people do exist. And there's, we're all just people engaging in things. We're going to do that the same way we've always done it. But like, what do you fucking do with that? How do you, where do you go from there?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is like, I guess I hope that eventually maybe things shift back in the other direction and people like move away from like these mass centralized social media sites. But I don't know if that's ever going to happen and I can't count on it. So there is an extent to which I am like, well, I'm just going to keep doing the work and I'm going to keep doing the stuff that I want to do for the people who want to see it. And I guess like hopefully I would like to eventually build like, I guess, community spaces for like artists to talk to each other and share their work that don't feel based around, trying to sell keychains or enamel pins, but are about like community building. Because I talked earlier about like, I don't want to be a temporarily embarrassed IP holder. I don't want to be a temporarily embarrassed, I don't want to be a small business owner. I'm an artist and like, I feel like sometimes it can be hard for me to find people who are like-minded, and the structure of the internet makes it harder and harder for people to really like see each other and communicate with each other directly because you're just seeing this like scrambled algorithmic feed. And I hope that eventually in my life I can like find the time and space and energy to think about like, how can I push back on that? And how can I like, try to like create space for people to communicate with each other and work together and do all this stuff without like sort of the thing of like, oh, how is this turning a profit?
Yeah. I mean, I do think it is really significant and it's productive along those lines that you are doing the work that you're doing and providing some space for discussion around it. That is something.
I also hope that just like people see what I'm doing and they realize that they can do the same thing, because I have no special qualifications or education. And I just like, I made my process of making a comic initially was just like, I was just like, well, I want to do this thing and I'm going to find a way to make this work.
Yeah. I mean, same years and years ago, that was my approach. I maybe the way that it works now is just the vast majority of the enormous population of people on the internet just have their attentions hacked and exploited in this particular modern technological way. But these little pockets of interested weirdos can actually find these things and attend to them, I mean, we're only ever going to be talking to a small population, probably. So maybe that's how
I mean,
it
the
works.
work that I make tends to be very niche because I don't want to compromise to make stuff that might be for a wider audience. Like, I guess I hope to eventually make stuff that's less, I'm not just going to like write about like super niche internet stuff forever. Like I have other interests and I want to do other types of stuff, but I'm also like, in general, I don't want to like make what I make in the hopes that like it'll be popular. I want to just make the stuff that I want to make the way that I want to make it.
Absolutely. What do you, that leads me, I guess, in the direction of like, what do you see your trajectory as from here? You're 3 or some years into what happens next. Is it a finite thing? Do you have a clear sense of how it ends?
I do know how it ends. Yeah, that's something I've known it's changed a little bit, and certainly like details of my outline have changed. And like I don't know exactly how long the comic is going to be. I initially had this vision that it would be 12 chapters, but now the chapters are way longer than they used to be, and I'm like, it might be more chapters, it might be less. I really don't
So
know. But it is a finite project. I'm not just going to like keep the ball in the air forever.
and you haven't planned it out so rigidly. You're indicating that's cool.
Yeah. Because I think if I had planned it out super rigidly, it's like, well, I'm not the person now that I was 4 years ago. My interests have evolved. What I want to do with the comic has evolved. So, like, I'm glad that I kind of left space for myself to be like, well, I can change this or that or do this differently or kind of drill down on or focus in on, certain elements and kind of, give less focus to others. I think that I think I've always been thinking from the beginning of like, how do I keep myself from just totally burning out on this and losing interest? And I've come close a few times, but I've never been like, oh yeah, I'm done. Fuck this. And I never want to get to that place until I want it to be done when it's done. I don't want it to be done because I gave up.
Yeah.
But it's hard, it's hard to make an ongoing webcomic, and a lot of people do just quit because it's a lot of work for not that much reward. I mean, I spent 3 years working on something that somebody could probably read in like an hour. I don't know.
Oh, it's a few hours. It's quite long.
Okay, a few hours, but like, yeah, it's like less than a day to read something that took 3 years to write and draw. And I certainly could have worked faster, but like, I draw very slowly, and I have other stuff going on.
That sort of train of thought used to stress me out a lot about how quick it is to read. But like, I mean, you're doing the whole thing yourself, and it's an entire like rich visual storytelling medium. How efficient do you expect it to be? Is what I've arrived at.
Yeah, comics is less efficient than some mediums and more efficient than others in terms of the amount of time, in terms of input versus output. And I just sort of have to come to terms with that. And it's the thing also of like the time will pass anyway. Like 3 years ago is always going to be 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Like I've, if it takes another 3 years to finish the comic, if it takes longer than that, then like, so be it, I guess.
That thought about in retrospect, thank God you had the idea to not lock yourself in too much to a certain framework for the story. I've had that thought 100 times. I mean, I did that comic Vaatu over the course of 12 years, which is like, would have been a fairly wild and grueling experience if I had stuck too rigidly to what I was thinking literally at your age when I started it.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, continue.
I think I'm fascinated a lot lately by this, like, the dynamics of serial storytelling in this webcomics front to back mode, and how you can really open up improvisation spaces for yourself, and it can become a very different thing than you start with.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when I'm working on a comic, like I'm currently working on the script for the next chapter because I haven't written that whole thing ahead of time, and it means that I have to put the comic on hiatus for a while. And I don't know how long it's going to take me to write a script. It might, come some scripts, like sometimes my writing comes together very quickly and sometimes it takes a really long time. But I'm also glad that I didn't try to write the whole comic out in advance. I think that A, probably I would have gotten bored in the process of doing that. And B, even if I had done that successfully, it's just I write differently now than I did 3 years ago. And a couple of years from now, I'm going to be writing differently than I do now. And it's sort of I want to leave myself room to kind of grow and change, and for that to be a part of the project and not a thing that exists in opposition to it.
Hell yeah. I think that's very human. Does it interest you at all does it interest you at all to work in the more formal, making a graphic novel parts of the comics world?
I don't know. Theoretically, it would be nice. It would be cool to have a book that's on a shelf. It would be nice to show my parents or my boyfriend's parents and be like, hey, I do something that's real. And I like reading books. It's cool to there's things that I enjoy about physical media specifically. I think What Happens Next in particular is not really suited to print, and I have no incipient plans to print it. I kind of wrote it to be on a website. But I've started doing more traditionally. I'm like working right now on a side project that has like pages that have like 6 panels on them, and they're like the size of a book page. And that's like an interesting experiment, and it's fun. Even though I don't know if I'll ever print that comic either. It's just like I'm doing something that like could exist in that idiom. In terms of
Cool.
like, I don't know. So like on some level, like I do kind of crave the legitimacy of having a printed book, and there are things that are artistically interesting about it to me. But it's also like I don't really know if I'm built for that. I think part of the reason that I do webcomics is because I'm not very good at doing anything else. I get fired from a lot of jobs. I, tend to do things late or slowly or not at all. And I like having the space that webcomics give me.
Hmm.
And if I had to like work on a deadline for a publisher, I would be afraid of coming up short and not succeeding or just not doing my best work in that context. So I guess the answer to that is like, I don't
Yeah.
know. There's things that seem cool about it and things that I can anticipate sucking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's it introduces certain pressures to the process that can feel a little bit ending up like compromising in ways that you may not want to compromise. But there's ways of building space for yourself and like developing sort of momentum and an audience that's large enough that you can compromise on less and less moving forward. God, that's an extremely obnoxious and abstract way of saying whatever the fuck I was trying to say. But there's very rigid, compromised ways of engaging with the industry, and then there's ways where you're a little more in
Yeah.
control. I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
excited about your work, and I'm excited to see what you do with it, and then you have some fucking momentum here. And that doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that you're going to just slot into the fucking comics industry in a particular way. I just,
Yeah. It's like,
I'm,
I don't know if the comics industry really wants me.
who knows what they
uh,
want, but
who knows, right?
it's
Yeah.
encouraging that you're thinking so fucking hugely and critically about this shit to me.
Thank you. I try, I guess. I think if I didn't think critically about stuff like this, I would always feel disappointed in myself for not being more productive or more successful or having a bigger audience. And it kind of behooves me to like, I guess, think critically so that I don't just sort of drive myself nuts, wanting things that I'm not going to get or expecting things from myself that I'm not, having expectations for myself that I'm not going to be able to live up to, or just like, I want to understand art in a way that makes room for the kind of person I am and the kind of thing that I want to do. And I feel like if I tried to sort of like not think critically about these things and just kind of go along with the expectations of the world, it would just kind of crush me.
Mm-hmm.